Նրան միանում են Էրիկ Հակոբյանը, Յուրի Ջորկաեֆը, Zoom-ով միանում է Փատրիկ Սարգսյանը և Zoom-ով միանում է Արտա Նազարյան Հարությունյանը։
Աստորեն սկսում ենք։ Բայց ձեզ ես Սուրմինա Մարկոսյանն եմ, այսօրվա թեմային անցնելուց առաջ հայավարի նախ եւ առաջ հարցումների հարցը լուծենք, էկրանին կերևա QR կոդ, որին հետևելով հղումով կարող եք հարցեր գրել, հղել պանելին, որոնց կանդրադառնանք պանելի վերջում եւ հիմա անցնենք թեմային։ Գոնե սպիտակ աթոռների վրա ինձանից բացի ուրիշ մարդ introduction-ի կարիք չունի ներկայացման, բայց թեմայի մասին Diaspora Soft Power and Our Global Brand, երբ որ արդեն մտածում ենք, թե ինչպես կարող ենք այս խոսակցությունը ձևակերպել, անդրադարձա, որ խնդիրներից մեկը, շատ հիմնական խնդիրներից մեկն է, որ Diaspora Սփյուռքը, Soft Power, փափուկ ուժ որպես այդպեսին հայկական հայերենում չկա, գոյություն չունի և our global brand հասկացողությունը նաև հայերեն լեզվով արևելա հայերեն կամ արևմտահայերեն առանձնապես շատ գործածություն չունի ու հասկանում է, փորձում էին հասկանալ, որ brand բառը ինչպես կարող ենք գործածել, վաճառանիշ, ապրանքանիշ, երկրի ապրանքանիշ, բավականին տարօրինակ է հնչում եւ մտահոգություններից մեկը այստեղ նաեւ այս խոսակցության ծիրից ներս նայեր, որ եթե չունենք բառակապակցությունները, եթե չունենք հասկացությունը բառը, բառապաշարը, հետեւաբար չունենք մտածելակերպը կամ ուղղվածությունը այս մասին մտածելու եւ կարծում եմ դա խնդիրներից մեկն է մեր այսօրվա քննարկման համար, ոչ թե լեզուն որպես այդպեսին, այլ ընկալումները, թե մենք ինչպես ենք հասկանում եւ ինչպես ենք ձևակերպում, դրա համար որպեսզի հասկանանք, թե մեր խոսակիցներից յուրաքանչյուրը ինչպես է ձևակերպում եւ ինչպես է հասկանում այսօրվա առաջ մեր առաջ ծավալված թեման, պիտի խնդրեի նախ եւ առաջ 5 րոպե միջև ամեն մարդ ներկայացներ իր մոտեցումը հարցին, որպեսզի կարողանանք հասնել միտեղ, որտեղից կարող ենք ընդլայնվել միասին։ Patrick, Յուրի, maybe you can start, because I know you have a limited time. Կարճ ժամանակդ մեր հետ այսօր։
Thank you. Hello everybody. I'm very happy to be here. I think not just happy, proud as an Armenian diaspora from France to be connecting with the world in Yerevan. And when Rubina we had this first chat about today, what was the most important? I think every topic are very important. What we are creating here is a continuation about our DNA, about what we are, where we are, and what we want to do. And I think it's very important today to put a good question on the table. I know there's a lot of topic, a lot of question about diaspora and Armenia, but I think it's time to think about what is the most important question for Armenia and what is coming from diaspora, but even from Armenia to diaspora. And I think our journey for myself and for all the speakers is to find a way to have this fluid communication, fluid link between the diaspora and Armenia. And I know that we had very strong valor and very strong identity outside Armenia, is to raise all these forces to use it for the good of Armenia. I took this 5 minutes I don't want to present myself, I don't want to tell you all the things that I did in my life as an individual, as personally, but what is important is to sit here and sharing my vision, but not just sharing, but listening you. And this is important, because I remember all the people I make some picture, I make some autograph and say, yeah, thank you very much. We were following football, we were following you during all your time, all your life, because you were scoring goal. I said, no, I was not scoring goal. You were pushing me to score goal. And I think today what we wanted to create it. You know, this power behind maybe a small country or a small organization or big organization, small government, but these forces to push it in the same direction. And let's find this direction.
Արցանց մեր հյուրերից maybe Patrick գուզեիք շարունակել խոսակցությունը?
What questions would you like me to address?
Maybe a 5-minute introduction as where you're approaching the subject from, your experience and your point of view. Ձեր տեսակետը եւ ձեր փորձառությունը թե որտեղից եք հարցին մոտենում եւ այսօր Յուրի ասածից ելնելով նաև անձնական ջանքից ավելի հավաքական ջանք դարձնելու ինչը հարցը գալիս է եկվոր soft power-ին, փափուկ ուժին.
So I think from my angle, it was always about first looking at the landscape. I started about 11 years ago with One Armenia, and the first idea was to assess what was missing inside of the sort of landscape from a strategic perspective. And the biggest thing for me was the collaboration, the lack of collaboration between organizations and between with the diaspora and Armenia. First and foremost, I didn't see enough engagement by both parts of the same whole, and that was the main reason why we came with the idea of One Armenia, because there's no Armenia if it's not a united force that's getting behind the development of the country, and it has to be the ideas and brain power and energy of the people in the country blended with the people outside. So for the last 11 years, I've been building community to facilitate that engagement and launching a variety of projects to see what resonates. Initially, using the second pillar of transparency as a way of making sure there was trust between these two halves of the whole, because trust is really at the core of sort of all community and all really development of GDP, development of a country. If you look at the often comparison between Armenia and Switzerland, and you look at the GDP difference, and you also look at the amount of trust in either of those scenarios, Switzerland has excelled to such a high level for many reasons, one of which is the amount of trust that exists between the world and the Swiss. So in the last 11 years, so much of the work has been about building back trust through a very transparent reporting on what happens with $1 through to 10,000 to 100,000, whatever anybody would engage with. So that was the sort of early framework by which we've engaged. At this point, we've pivoted everything after the invasion of our country towards building emotional connectivity between the diaspora, both Armenian and non-Armenian, and Armenia through tourism, which in my opinion is one of the most powerful soft power tools with which we can emotionally engage and build apathy and connection for the country, because what we saw during the conflict and after within the Armenian circles and non-Armenian circles was a disgusting level of apathy, which drove us insane. And we said, we have to focus our efforts on making sure people come, tell the stories of this amazing place, and get people to care and emotionally connect them to the country to care, because without that, I didn't feel, and the group didn't feel, that there was much of a chance to get people to do anything if they didn't actually emotionally connect first. I emotionally connected first through FAR when I took the first trip in 2000, and ever since that, my engagement is based on that emotional connection. So that's where our work is centered on for the next decade. So we work in decades, and the first decade was about collaboration, community, and transparency. This next decade is about, at the core, emotional connection.
Անչափ շնորհակալություն եւ իսկապես մի քանի թեմա, որ պիտի ուզեի նաեւ քննարկենք հետո գեր զգացողական կապվածությունը Հայաստանի հետ, անտարբերությունը Հայաստանի հանդեպ, որ երկուսն էլ խնդիրներ են, որ ունենք եւ այսօր այս քննարկման շրջանակներում նաեւ միգուցե կարող ենք քննարկել, հուսով եմ առիթ կունենանք։ Արդա քո ներդրումը։
Thank you, Rubina. So I would like to just define a few terms, if that's okay, because I think when we talk about soft power, and I like, Patrick, the point you made about tourism is one of the most powerful soft powers. But in my opening, I just want to define a few terms. First, soft power versus hard power versus smart power. And the term originated with a former dean at Harvard Kennedy School. So hard power is military, economic sanctions, things like that. Right now, that's not where we excel necessarily. Soft power is a lot of other things, including tourism, like Patrick mentioned, including sports diplomacy, gastro diplomacy. I know, Rubina, you and I talked about caviar diplomacy, which we find very offensive and in a lot of ways hypocritical. And I think you'll talk about that a little bit more. But the idea of soft power is where we absolutely can excel. And a third category that isn't talked about as often is smart power, which is kind of combining them. So that's the first thing. The second kind of term I'd love to define is diaspora. And, you know, Patrick nailed it with the concept of one Armenia. We can no longer, and we've been saying this for decades, but we can't look at ourselves as in country and out of country because we are one global nation. So I think it's really important that we look at it that way, and Յուրի also touched on that in terms of pushing in the same direction. So that understanding of diaspora is really important. Third thing is the word brand, and I love, Rubina, that you started by defining it, trying to say it, you know, how the Armenians would say it. You know, Armenia's brand could be a couple of things. Unfortunately now, some people see our brand as having lost a devastating war, a lot of complaining, most of it legitimate, but that's really not who we are. But the idea of what is our brand, I would argue our brand should be defined by Nobel laureates, Pulitzer Prize winners, CEOs of major companies, leaders in every industry. You look at sports, science, the arts, culture. Our brand is one of leaders, innovators, thinkers, and it's absolutely critical that we get into the mindset that we focus on those positives. I also have to say our brand, you know, the church is very much part of our brand because but for our institution of the church, our nation would not have survived for thousands of years. So that's the little bit of Sunday school teacher in me coming out, but also I believe that quite passionately. And finally, the last point I would like to make, and I touched on mindset, but how we approach this issue of communications. My background is communications, almost 40 years working in the field, professionally and as a volunteer, you know, in our community. We really do have to learn to understand the art of strategic communications versus PR. Because to me, PR is sometimes just you pitch a story, it shows up, great, that's wonderful. But strategic communications is truly understanding who we're trying to reach. And I know one of the points of this discussion is figuring out who our audiences are, what we want from them, and a very key concept is how does our purpose fit into their purpose? So right now, we get frustrated by how we're covered in the mainstream media. But we have to make our story fit into the global story. So I just heard something on the news, yesterday where they were talking about the war in Ukraine, and it was shocking that for the first time, white phosphorus was used in a war. And I'm screaming into this echo chamber thinking, wait a second, what happened 2 years ago? So what I did was a really small, minor thing, which was email the reporter. It is so easy to reach reporters either by email or social media, and just simply said, I'm not looking for a story, but I'm sure you also would like to know facts. And that's the kind of, it's just one example, but it's something that we all can do, whether we are in Armenia, in Artsakh, in the diaspora, where when we see misinformation, because I don't think the journalists intended to have misinformation, we not attack. Our mindset has to be one of constructive feedback. And we all have to be in that boat together. And that's where one piece at a time we can move forward. So I wanted to define these terms only because when we have a discussion like this, where we have journalists on the stage, athletes with global presence, very smart marketing people, I think that this is where we can work together to kind of move ourselves forward, in using our soft power most effectively.
Միանշանակ հստակ է, որ խնդիր ունենք այսօր հասկանալու եւ բարձրաբանելու, թե տարբեր կոմպոնենտների միջև հարաբերությունները ինչպես են կարգավորում, որպեսզի կարողանանք հասնել, ճիշտ փոխհարաբերությունների, ճիշտ ով է ասում եւ ում է ասում, ինչու է ասում, ինչպես ենք մեր այսօրվա հաղորդակցությունը կազմակերպում, որովհետեւ իսկապես փափուկ ուժի, soft power-ի կամ միգուցե համոզիչ ուժի, խելացի ուժի հիմնական բաղադրիչներից մեկը հենց communication. Eric?
Merci. Thank you very much. I think we want to simplify these terms. Branding, frankly, is just the narrative, the story you tell about yourself. And we live in a world in which branding is 80% of everything that happens. The story you tell about yourself, is the house that you live in. I am totally confident of our ability to actually tell a very successful story, because we actually have successful stories. However, I think for our purposes of having this discussion be useful, we need to be very honest about our failures in telling our story. And if you go back 100 years, what has been the Armenian nation's story? It's actually three things. The first one is the genocide, which we end up focusing on the wrong thing. We focus on the crucifixion rather than the resurrection. Then you have the struggle of the people of Artsakh, which was actually a national liberation struggle against genocidal forces. And we managed to whittle that away in 30 years to talk about occupation and other things. So we totally failed there. Lastly, what we like to tell the world is that we're the world's first Christian nation, which is possibly true, but in a Europe that is becoming more de-Christianized every day, it's also completely irrelevant and makes you look quite reactionary. So what should be our narrative? We know what we failed in, but our narrative is essentially this new conception, the new cultural freedom that we have. We actually have a great gift to give to the world, because we have a conception of freedom that is attractive to people outside of the West. And that is, yes, you can live as an individual, but we also live in communities and we live in solidarity. And we've sort of, as we have failed in so many different parts in this narrative fight around the world, that's the one thing that we actually are a tremendous success in this country. The second one is the real practical one, and we should repeatedly say this, is look at the map. We're an island of democracy in a sea of tyranny. I tell people this, especially foreigners who come here, that I can get on my show on a daily basis, weekly basis, and criticize the Prime Minister, the intelligence services, the heads of the military in the harshest terms, and no one knocks on my door to tell me, why don't you come to our headquarters? That is not true in almost all of the countries around us. Frankly, in most of the countries around us from here to South Korea. That wouldn't be true. So that's the other thing we need to focus on. And lastly, and I think this is key, is the sort of the economic development model, and specifically our IT sector. We need to make them much bigger stars. Even if they're whatever they are in reality, we got to make them much bigger. Precisely for one reason, is because the greatest wealth created in the world today is IT. So we need to be known as that. We need to constantly drive home that point, even if it means we need to exaggerate it. Thank you.
General question. Yes, այս պանելը հայերենով եմ վարում, բայց բոլոր զրուցակիցներս անգլերեն են խոսում, եթե առարգություններ չկան դահլիճից, միգուցե ես էլ անգլերենի դարձնեմ։ Կան, չկան? Thumbs up. Okay, thank you. Are there any? I can do it. Okay. I just realized that, again, we're communicating, not communicating with each other with the easiest way that we could communicate. For example, I was trying to speak a mix of Western and Eastern Armenian, and everyone had to listen to a translation. You could have done that, but we could have been a team here. Well, Eric, coming back to what you're saying, and there definitely can be a shift in our narratives, which would be part of our global brand, and rebranding, or if let's maybe start from, do we have a brand? What is our brand? Do we need rebranding? What you said, Eric, definitely points to the direction that we definitely need to rebrand. However, my concern with your suggestion is that most of the time we don't believe it. We still believe that we were massacred, we were not resurrected because of the genocide, not necessarily. We still don't know at this point. It's a cross-section. It's like, are we victors? Have we been victors? Or was that first victory a false victory in our, was like not a holding victory, a victory we could not capitalize on to the end. And with the Christian nation, okay, I understand that's definitely a historical value, cultural value, but do we, first of all, as Armenians, identify firstly as a democracy, is Christianity that big part of our narrative today? Because all our conflicts right now are not necessarily religious conflicts. They're hardly branded as religious conflicts. So pushing that forward, is that going to benefit it? Well, basically my question here is that, do we not have to believe it first ourselves before we can present ourselves as such to the world, to be convincing? Whoever answers.
I'm jumping on the question. I think it's maybe it's a problem of education. When I say education, is truly you got this feeling that as an Armenian you don't have so many chances. You have one shot, you know, and this chance, you know, sometimes you don't want to use it because you're scared about failure. And do I go in this direction? Yes, but if I miss a step, I will go down, and it will take decades and years to turn back. And I think it's how you give it, or you teach it, or you educate it, your generation, young generation, to believe in failure, because failure is part of life. And we had dramatic failure in our story, but what I'm thinking is really to break this mentality to say, I don't take the chance because if I miss the chance, I will fail. And moving forward on this, it's this mindset to reteach, because we had the DNA is here. We can feel it. We can feel the DNA is inside us, really, and we are stronger than any country around us because we're still here. This is the reality. We're still here when everybody wants us to be not anymore in this world, and I think you're right to say that to define the DNA or the brand of Armenian is so important. Maybe we should start by that. Who are they today? We know from the history, we know from the war, we know from the genocide, but today what was the present and the future of Armenia? And this is we should take all the positive things that are happening in our life to really structure this identity, this brand identity that we needed, all of us.
Patrick, we can't hear you. Sorry. Just give us a moment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So all brands are really comprised of a series of either deposits or what you could call withdrawals. And the constituents for the brand, which are everybody sitting in Armenia and everybody who cares about Armenia around the world, will make those deposits or those withdrawals. And I think the main issue that we have and that needs to be coalesced is the fact that there's no coordination between those making the deposits as to what the common narratives are. Back to what Eric was saying, when you look at kind of this global people who can make deposits, herding cats is a term that's used. I mean, it's an understatement for how diffuse these sort of voices are. So within those kind of dynamics, who do you look to sort of coalesce narratives into more sort of common thematics? You look to organizations that are leaders. You look to the leaders themselves. You look to celebrities within the diaspora and within Armenia to bring those narratives forward and for others to then support those narratives. And those become series of deposits where the Japanese have a saying, all arrows pointed in the same direction, which ultimately creates momentum if you're focused and centered on a few key themes. To use a trite example, but look at Israel and the last decade of what they've spent narratively articulating about the country. It's very close to what Eric was saying. It's about this phenomenal ecosystem, which before it was a phenomenal ecosystem, they just promoted it in a common way, with writing books about it, with the leaders talking about it, with famous people discussing it, bringing influential people in to support the narrative and building that narrative until eventually they became the second most invested country in the world. So at the point we're at, it's like pick a few key things, 2 or 3, and rally behind them and do it in the Japanese method where all arrows point in the same direction, because if not, you're just basically, as we say, pissing in the wind, excuse the vile analogy, but the message doesn't get very far. I'm sure, Arda, you can say that more elegantly.
Well, my question in this case, sorry, Arda, would be maybe you can also talk about this. Who decides what those narratives are and where do they come from? Because if we're waiting for those narratives to organically come forward and present themselves to us, then we're wasting time, and probably there's going to be a lot of miscommunication between different actors or holders of soft power. So how do we generate those commonly agreed upon narratives that we can start disseminating and communicating them? I think this is one of our biggest challenges right now, because we're also, as a nation, as in the situation that we're in, to some extent probably being reactionary. We're talking about soft power because we do not have enough deterrence capabilities right now at the border, and we're resorting to soft power. But even in doing so, we might still, maybe let's discuss this, be reactionary in this. So how do we generate those commonly agreed upon narratives that are constructive for Armenia, and who disseminates them? Maybe this should be the questions that we should be looking for answers to.
Well, I think the key...
Arda, do you want to take this? I interrupted you, sorry.
No, yeah. It's totally fine, because I mean, look, no nation has one single message. And I say this as a proud Armenian, as a proud American. And so, you know, it's an excellent question. In the ideal world, there would be a boss of everyone who says, this is what our story is, and let's all move forward and point the arrows in the same direction. That's not happening. So one point I was going to make before, which I just want to get in, is the fact that survival is victory, but we must stop looking back and we must look forward. So in that way, I really endorse what Eric said in terms of the things that we failed on, but that's okay, fine, let's learn from that and let's move forward. To your point, Rubina, I think, any one of us and many, in the audience can come up with what the narrative is, but absolutely, we are a nascent democracy in a sea of tyranny. Agree with Eric 100% on that. So is that our excuse for not being able to move forward? No, but it's pointing to the world what challenges we have. So what I hear on a weekly basis is Armenia allied with this? Is Armenia allied with that nation? And we say, just look at where we are. We know what our values are. We know what our history is. We know what our plan is going forward. I agree 100% on, IT as a sector. Tourism as a sector, wine as a sector, women as a strength point for Armenia. What the exact narrative is, I think we can come up with right now and hope, we have it 70 or 80% right and move forward that way. We have a lot of smart Armenians across every sector this world has seen who can contribute to that constructive storytelling going forward. The answer to your question, there's no one person who's going to direct it, but I think as long as most of us are working in that direction, it is moving forward for our global nation. So there's no easy answer, but in terms of constructing a narrative which will help define our brand, that I think that we can agree on and then work on it. And the last point I want to make on this is, ultimately, it's the government of a nation that sets its trajectory. That's without doubt. But with all governments, there's a need to rely on, some people call them technocrats, others call them experts, and that's the part that we really have to capitalize on. Because one thing I will tell you from just my most recent visit to Armenia is the inflow of intellectual power, passion, repatriated people. This is all assets we have and what we should be tapping into in a constructive way.
One thing, can I add on that for one moment? If you look at the work actually that Arda has done, sorry, Arda, but I have to plug you and your group's work. A lot of the thematics that she was talking about, the female empowerment, the democracy in a sea of tyranny, the tech strength in the market, those aren't just sort of ideas that are abstract. I mean, those are written about with strong narratives. And if you just sort of look at the work that Arda and a few select people have been doing to change the narratives towards that, those are fantastic deposits for the brand, in addition to things like the hidden track that is being done by the Minister of Tourism, et cetera. And those are all going forward. It's about getting behind them and pushing them with more force and supporting them and not being voices to sort of derail them, but to support the stories, to promote them. So the more deposits, the more strength collectively that we push that forward with. That's exactly what Israel did. The last decades of communication was just let the narrative surface and let the people who support Israel and its depositing into its success push them forward so the world can touch those narratives. So it's about now people rallying behind a lot of what Ara and her team is actually doing.
Yeah, I think you asked the ultimate question, how is change made? Because so much of this is about change. Change in a modern context actually happens in two ways. It really, no matter how much we believe in democracy, small d Democrats, in reality what changes things is what I call elite consensus. When either the ownership class or the real leaders of the country or the people that matter sort of come up with a narrative for the country. And then over time, that sort of becomes what everybody says. I mean, the greatest success story in narrative telling is the United States. No, this is the center of world PR. You know, everybody in America will say they believe in the American dream, even if it's not real, and they can't really define it. So it's sort of a good narrative becomes the air. It's sort of like asking a fish. If you ask a fish, you swim in water, it's the last things they'll say. You know, it's like, because that's just what they know. So the narrative is really to create that elite consensus on 2 or 3 points that you constantly hammer away at. And, you know, I come from North America, where there's always idiotic optimism. And I come to Armenia, where there's always idiotic pessimism. And there's got to be some happy medium in between the two. And that happy medium is, yes, having a story that you tell, understanding that some of it, frankly, it's just a story, while at the same time understanding that there's actually elements of truth in that story.
Յուրի, unfortunately, I'm told it's time for you to leave. But any remarks before you leave, please?
I'm sorry. First, I'm sorry to leave, but I want to point the quality of the speaker. Really, it was very interesting to listen all your view on this topic, and really is not so hard at the end. We just starting to speak about 45 minutes, and we already on the same direction. We already move forward. We already have some different topic, but the good topics, you know. And I think this is great. Talking 45 minutes only, Eric, is why we not meeting more each other?
Why don't
we don't sharing more each other? I mean, if we're talking about democracy is the first thing, is to be free to talk, free to share, and today we have the chance in Armenia to be in a democracy, and this we have as a diaspora to use it as far as possible. And positive message, yes, I have. I'm coming more often in Armenia. We're spending maybe 4 or 5 days every 2 months with my brothers, with my family, and we can see the big change. We can see that it's just the beginning, and we should believe, even if sometimes it's hard, even sometimes it's not on the way that we want it, but we should believe in us. Only us, because sometimes we feel alone, but if we are all together, we can be really, really good. I'm going to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sorry to leave, but it's time.
Guys, I'm going to ask you here maybe to wrap up about the first part of our conversation is, can we specify with all the right kind of communication and when the narratives surface as they do, and we find this happy medium between idiotic optimism and idiotic pessimism, what is our ask and expectation from soft power? Because it is a very similar question to everything we've talked about, that there's a nuance here, because coming back to being reactionary, and given the time frame, given today, we're discussing this today, not 2 years ago where we didn't have this situation, and not 2 years from now. What should be the realistic ask in this case?
Do you want me to get started? Well, first of all, you know, we've talked about the distinctions between soft power, smart power, all different kinds of power. But there's a common word there, and that's power. And power is ultimately, if you want to know what power is to get people to say yes when they want to say no. That's the raw understanding of power. So how that power is achieved, whether it's soft or hard, doesn't really matter. So we're talking about, how do we build up power? That's the ultimate question. So soft power is just simply another form of power. So we should have been working on soft power for 30 years, for 100 years. While at the same time, in real terms, we have to work on hard power. Because at the end of the day, hard power will always overpower soft power just because it's harder. I mean, it's just common sense. So, but the dynamic narrative of power, which is political power, economic power, is the same thing. You need a country that is richer. You need a country that isn't isolated. You need a country that's a better diplomats. You need a country that tells a better story. But this is a seamless web. I think these distinctions are just about the how-to. They're not about the total understanding of the nature of power.
It's also, and I'm sorry, Patrick, I'm just going to jump on that because it's the how-to, it's also the why we matter. And I think, and I'm going to say this, Eric, I'm an idiotic optimist with a dose of pragmatism. And I think the only reason why I'm still as passionate now as I was in the early 1980s on this Armenian identity is because you have to be optimistic. If you aren't, we don't have room for you. And anyone who's destructive is not going to be helpful. But the point I want to make is it's also about relevance. You asked a good question, Rubina. What's the ask? Well, we know what the ask is, whether it's foreign aid or, allyship or military support or, investment in our infrastructures and programs and things like that. We have a number of asks that advocacy groups go after. But it's really about how are we relevant? Why does Armenia matter? And we could make an argument why having this democracy in the sea of tyranny is valuable to so many nations across the globe, but then we have to be able to articulate it with the right spokespeople, the right examples, the right, alliances and things like that. That's where, I think the issue of relevance, every single person has to articulate why Armenia is relevant and why thousands of years later we truly matter to the global stage, even though we are a fraction of our historic size. It's not about the size of the nation, as we see, and people have raised Israel several times. It's not the size of the nation. It's like, what do you do for the world? How do you make the world better? How are you helpful across these sectors that we said we have leadership on? So I think that's really the issue of, the issue of relevance is something we have to constantly hone in on.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, the lingua franca today is content, and quality content in particular. So what I would say, just as a pragmatic step very briefly, is support the people who create quality content, both Armenian and non-Armenians who can tell the story about Armenia in one of the different vectors that we're covering, and get them to come to Armenia and tell stories. Because quality content is how this world works. It's a flat world when it comes to, whether it's a media outlet or just somebody with influence or just something that goes viral. But you have to invest in that content in order for people to actually hear the stories, and it has to be high quality. It's not just, anybody making content, but actually the content creators that matter, bring them to Armenia. And that's something that any Armenian can do from anywhere in the world, is to encourage somebody who is a high quality content creator to come in and pick one of these storylines and run with it. So that way you have this sort of constant flow of quality content coming into the ecosystem, and the quality always rises up. So that's a very pragmatic step that anybody listening can take.
The role of the diaspora in this, because earlier during our conversations and where we were talking about Armenia's branding, I think that there's an issue of miscommunication also between Armenia, the state, and the diaspora, because the same way as the world sometimes does not understand what Armenia's branding or image is at this point, sometimes the diaspora has some questions. And of course we can talk about diaspora is not homogeneous, diaspora is not diaspora, the Armenian diaspora is not what kind, and then does not communicate with Armenia the same way. But do we first need to address the issue of Armenia's branding, or branding and soft power, with diaspora before we go global with this? Because diaspora is our most valuable tool here. So I'm trying to understand if our most valuable tool and what we have is actually also something that needs to be fixed before we can use it.
I don't know if the word fixed is right. I think it's more so encouraged and incentivized to engage. You know, there's a lot of negativity that has sort of permeated in the last couple of years post-conflict. That's fine. People can choose to be negative. I think the idea is supporting the people who are positive to engage. And I think it is the responsibility of the government and organizations who are engaged in Armenia and individuals who are vested and can afford to financially support a few of these narratives by saying, okay, I'm putting up X amount of dollars to bring filmmakers, to bring content creators, et cetera, to tell these stories. You have to invest in this. This is not something that just organically can happen. You invest with purpose and intention, and the intention is to get people to create content around narratives. That's one simple slice of it, and you pick the narratives. I don't think there's one brand for Armenia, as we've been talking about. I mean, yes, I said all arrows pointing in the same direction, but there will never be one direction in Armenia. It's just the reality. I mean, we have the hidden track, which is a tourist message that connects with a segment of tourism. And tourists, let's say, that want to come to find something, you know, to discover the undiscovered, so to speak. But that's one of like 4 very ripe categories that you can invest in and engage in. So I don't know if it's about changing the diaspora or what have you. It's just pick the people who are engaged, who are positive, and work off of that framework. The change makers.
I agree with almost all of that. First of all, we need to be a little bit honest about ourselves, about diaspora. Technically, Margarita Simonian is part of the diaspora, and so is Serge Tankian, okay? So are they, I mean, yes, technically, yeah, you can laugh, but technically, we can say she's a diaspora. So the issue is, I have one distinction. Are you actively doing something useful in Armenia, or you're not doing something actively useful in Armenia? Everything else doesn't matter. If you want to sit in your, single one-bedroom in Glendale and complain about how the war should continue, then, I don't have use for you. So the issue is, what does the diaspora do to make itself useful in Armenia? If we actually have to worry about messaging to them when we have a far more relevant thing of messaging to the world, then, we'll never get out of this hole. So I think we just need to triage between the useful people who are actually doing things and the useless people who talk and don't do anything, and stop cutting these people that are just these centers of negativity, giving them the respectability that they don't deserve.
We'll let that sink in for a second. But I have to say, I had my first boss used to say, anyone can knock something down, but it takes a good person to build something. And he used choicer words than that. But I think that's what we have to think about when you ask that question, Rubina. And it's exactly to Eric's point and what Patrick touched on. I believe, and I say this, we're among Armenians now, but I do truly believe that we are smarter, sharper, more intuitive, more compassionate than most other people in the world, only because of our historic experience. But we have to turn those qualities into constructive action, which again, never forget the past, you must focus on the future, otherwise we are doomed. So I think this idea of using the diaspora, and again, it's not a monolithic thing, in whatever way possible is what we should be doing. And those who are not part of building something, whatever that something is, but we know what we are trying to do, we are building a nation, a global nation, then just get out of the way, because what's happening is that too much is being focused on the negative energy, and it's sucking from the constructive energy that so many people are working on. And is everything being worked on by every organization now critical to that path forward? Probably not. but it's still ways to engage different people in the work that we're doing. And so we find those people who take their individual interests and passions and put it as part of the whole. And that's where the efforts have to be. And that has to be encouraged and nurtured by people in power. And again, I love, Erica said, define what power is. It's like getting people to do stuff. That's what it is, using whatever tools we have. So that's where our mindset has to be. And all of us deal with adversity in our community and in our volunteer efforts and everything else we do. And guess what? We deal with it in our jobs also, but we don't quit our jobs the second we hit adversity. We try to figure out how to work through it. So that's where the mindset has to be.
In fact, people love a story about the little engine that could. Yeah. And we really are the little engine that could against all of these great odds, the things that are being accomplished in Armenia. We give ourselves real credit for that, but it's a really amazing thing to see with such a challenged country how much is actually being created across the wide variety of things we're talking about today. I mean, in tech, with women, with the sort of resurfacing of tourism. That's an incredible thing. And music, look at what's happening in music in Armenia and how it has this global reach now with, the stuff that happened with Kami Kami and, her success. So just supporting all of that. I mean, even Eric's show, for instance, taking that and pushing it out to people who are non-Armenian and getting them, that's quality content. Push it out to them and say, look at this little engine look at what Eric's saying about this country. And this country is just constantly facing adversity. Like, the first campaign that we ever did, a fellow Ben Toker in San Francisco put it in his Facebook, and the co-founder, Steve Wozniak of Apple, donated $500 and said, Armenia, go Armenia. It was the first campaign ever. It was like 11 years ago, because he was rooting for the underdog. People like to root for the underdog. Just embrace that and play with it. Don't take it we're so serious and macabre sometimes, like, about ourselves. Don't take it so seriously. Have some fun with it. Like, people like fun, the fun little engine that can make it, even though like our enemies and environment is not particularly fun. Have a little levity with it.
Well, we definitely can play around with the idea of being the underdog, but maybe probably that will clash with our egos of like centuries old hub of all civilization kind of ego that we have. But referring to what Յուրի said about not fearing failure, I'm going to add to his concept this fear, this love for disappointment that we have. We're always disappointed very easily, and Arda, you were kind of referring to that also, right? Like instantly disappointed because expectations are very high. And I'm going to add another layer because we have a question here, which we kind of spoke about, but if you guys want to talk about it more. This question is, if we don't know or recognize what's our brand, how are we supposed to promote it? First of all, like we talked about this narrative surfacing and the need for a more vertical messaging from the government of Armenia saying, this is our strategy, this is where we want to be, this is how we want to be seen. And another question here, it's kind of related. How should we deal with the victim mentality when promoting this Armenian brand? Because yes, we are, and I agree with you, this personally, this victim mentality, this, oh my God, I'm again disappointed, I'm again let down. I'm not talking about the genocide or the war. We are always victimizing ourselves even within our daily realities that are some things that can be easily overcome if we say, okay, well, let's try again.
The response to that is grow the hell up. Today's Armenians, even in these really difficult circumstances, this is the richest, most educated, best connected Armenian nation in its history. That's reality. I'm not spinning anything. People talk about, I'm disappointed, or we're facing long odds. Let's go back to 1920. We were a country of 500,000 orphans. Okay? Those orphans grew up and they crushed fascism in Europe. Their grandkids won the first Artsakh war. So you want to cry? Go cry. We're not interested in that.
That was how I opened, where I said, what is our brand? Is our brand pathetic, whiner, loser, victim, whatever? Or is our brand resilient, positive, forward-looking, innovative, winners of the things that we know we are winners in? And it comes back to attitude and mindset. And I sound like a mom now, but it's the kind of thing where we have to mother our way or parent our way through this. And sometimes we will have kids who are a little more whiny and a little more negative and focus on the bully and focus on the loss and whatever, and we say, grow up. I agree totally. And that's where we have to really say, who is part of this challenging, but really, you know, it's enthralling in some ways. And I don't mean to sound Pollyannish or ignorant or naive, but you know, some people thrive on taking something challenging and growing from it, evolving from it, and other people thrive on cowering in the corner and saying, but I'm the victim, help me, please. You know, there was an excellent piece on, you know, on EVN Report that was written about saying, stop looking to everyone else to solve our problems. We have solutions in ourselves. And no, we don't have one direction from one leader telling us where we're going, but guess what? We have a lot of smart people with the right attitudes collaborating. So let's kind of get the right narrative together and move forward. And no, another line I use often, which, you know, people are tired maybe of hearing, is the price of perfection is bankruptcy. Yeah. There is no perfect solution for Armenia moving forward right now, but we have a heck of a lot of really good ones. So let's not keep, you know, wringing our hands until the perfect, you know, star comes down from the sky and says, this is what we are supposed to follow.
It's not going to happen either. The government of Armenia, when it comes to modern communications, is really completely detached from that concept, and that's not meant in a, you know, as a criticism. It's just a reality. It's not a discipline that is really studied in Armenia. It's not something that, you know, it's not a pragmatic discipline according to Armenian history. So to answer your question, Rubina, about, you know, where is the narrative going to come from? It has to come from the experts who work in the field, like Eric and others, who can coalesce it into a few. We've touched on them today. They're not that foreign or that, let's say, far from us. They're right in front of us. Just get behind them and support them. You know, the four categories that I think were most ostensible were, you know, the support of women and their success in Armenia and the sort of modern trajectory of women. Secondly is tech. You can say third would be something like wine, and fourth is, you know, a democracy in a sea of tyranny. If you just take those four, or even write it down to whatever three you think are I mean, those are the common narratives that can be pushed, and that's not going to come down from some sort of, you know, communication spaceship. It's just, you know, the government is not working. They've got other things that they're focused on, let's say. So let's focus on those narratives and support them.
I got this. I think this one is working. Yeah, it's fine. I'm going to play the devil's advocate, and also as a journalist and an editor. We can, how many wine stories and women's success stories and tourist stories can you tell? And eventually the world will turn and say, so what? So you have wine, we have wine. You have successful smart women, so you know what? The world is full of them. You have tourism, yeah, not bad, but there are far better places on the face of the earth, and good job on the democracy. So how long can we pull this narrative before the world asks, actually, so what else? Because, you know, there's only so much that we can do. Of course, there's a lot of area we haven't covered, and a lot of people haven't heard the story. Here, my question is, should we keep telling the same story? Because what our IT is a rising star. But you know what? It's also not perfect, and within a couple of years, it actually might be a very mediocre sector in Armenia. So do we keep telling the same stories over and over again?
No, we don't, and I don't think it's, first of all, we're at ground zero of communication. We barely have any narrative threads in the world of communications. Just in the last, let's say, 2 years, because I think of artists, her group's work, there are some major publications that are looking at Armenia and covering them. But prior to that, you're talking about, if you just were to plot out the amount of stories and narratives being told about the country, I mean, de minimis amount of storytelling. We hear it ourselves, and I think it's in an echo chamber because we're speaking to ourselves most of the time. But from a broader perspective, it's absolutely not on the radar of anyone in the world. I mean, you can point to a few, oh, there was a Wall Street Journal or New York Times article here or there, et cetera, but that's number one. Number two, the narratives always evolve. So you're starting somewhere and you're building a foundation, and it's ultimately a structure of communications that, has to have a strong foundation. And the other thing to say is that, you're talking also about narratives, but then how about just look at storytelling and, film and music, et cetera. That's soft power. Look at what Korea has done with content, from boy bands all the way through to winning Academy Awards for film. We haven't even started inside of that world. So let's not just relegate it to like the media and how it's covered inside of the world of, let's say, journalism. We have a long way to go. We're at ground zero, if that.
Absolutely true, but I'm also going to kind of stitch in this question that we got online as like, basically I'm paraphrasing by saying, okay, all this is good, but we're also trying to counter Turkey's soft power that is immense, and Azerbaijan's, I'm adding Azerbaijan, it wasn't in the question. So in this relationship, are we on that road to hiastaputsu, in our favorite word, disappointment?
I mean, if you look at Twitter all day and you count just look at the conflict and you say, what happened last time, they were extremely organized with bots and also a team of people who were communicating on Twitter, and they destroyed us on Twitter, because we were completely unprepared and ununified. So, are we going to win the war on Twitter by just sort of having a few people here or there versus, an entire force of people dedicated to spreading misinformation and their own narratives about a conflict? No, we don't have anything close to that. So if you want to just distill it down to one social media tool, and the most obvious one for, sort of bickering in ways that are inflammatory, yeah, we're not ready for that, and we're not organized around that at all. So that's one part of the equation. It's not the sum of the whole.
Well, first of all, it doesn't matter what the other side does. You still got to tell your story, and you got to keep hammering away at it. Secondly, their quote-unquote soft power has magnificent holes in it that we haven't even touched in tearing apart. Again, going back to our scale of failure, and as Patrick, talked about Twitter, we are losing, imagine you're in our foreign ministry, we're losing a narrative story to a country whose vice president sleeps with the president, whose national hero is an axe murderer, who executes POWs and puts it out themselves. It's not even leaked. So this is the people that we're losing to. So I'm not too worried about what they do, because we haven't even grasped what we're doing. Well, so unless we take our first steps, I wouldn't even worry about how we engage them. I can tell you, as a public relations professional, I have watched, Turkey is different. If you watched the Azeri public relations, there's two extremes. They are extremely good at anything that can be bought or is behind closed doors.
I was going to say, caviar diplomacy is also a soft power.
Absolutely.
So we're going to counter at this point with decency and fairness and democracy, raising democracy.
Let me give you a perfect example of a story that should be in every newspaper that we have not told. Just to give you a perfect example of a recent failure. If you open up the international press, it's all these stories about Russians in Georgia. Okay? Russians in Georgia who walk into a restaurant and people don't serve them simply because they're Russian. Okay? in Armenia, there is not a single case of someone who has come here from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia that has been attacked, beaten, not given an apartment, not allowed into a restaurant, okay? Not a single case of it. And this is not a rich country. I know people that have been moved out of their $300 or $400 apartments that's been rented to Russians for $1,000, and not a single one of them has told me that they hate Russians. So we have this great, imagine what a great story this would be to tell.
Armenians
have-
giving up apartments and financial
No,
possibilities
not-
to,
you
and
have-
not being angry
No, you
about
have
it.
no. You have people fleeing war, and because we understand what that means, we don't act the way that the worst people in other cultures do.
We are at our core, and of course there's always exceptions. At our core, we are decent people, we are honest people. I naively say we have the truth on our side. So the soft and hard powers of our enemies are singularly focused on destroying us. We are focused on building our nation. So going back to your question, Rubina, so what? That's what I tell my students. 2 words you never want to hear someone say to you. You write something, you say something, and then it ends with someone saying, so what? That's what we don't want. So the so what is, I agree with Patrick 100% that the stories are just starting to be told. I mean, we haven't even hit ground zero to be on par with some of the others regarding these stories. But more significantly, to your point, because the global scene, the geopolitical scene is constantly evolving, Armenia needs to find a way to be relevant to that story. So we constantly talk about Turkey and Azerbaijan. What about China? What about India? What about Israel? You know, we're constantly hearing about what people did to us, how they side with our enemy and whatever, and then we say, we're not gonna talk to them, we're not gonna play in their sandbox, you know, we're mad at them. Well, let's keep thinking forward, right? So because things are always evolving, and you know, you read the stories now about Turkey's alliance with, you know, Israel, and you look back 5-10 years and you say that never would have happened. So where is Armenia going to see itself 5-10 years from now on that geopolitical scene? It comes back to being relevant to how things work. The region we're in, the neighbors we have, what they're doing, who they're with, you know, so that's, I think, something to keep in mind about the stories we're telling and how we are connecting with those storytellers, whether they're journalists or influencers or anything else. And Eric's 100% right. Like, yeah, how many people did know that the vice president's sleeping with the president? When you tell people that Aliyev's wife is the vice president, they're like, really? Wow. And when you talk about caviar diplomacy, you know, they are literally buying, I mean, there were stories in publications like The Economist about caviar diplomacy 5 years ago. And yet, money covers all evil. While Յուրի was here, I should have raised the whole issue of, you know, everyone was crazy about live golf in Saudi Arabia and sports diplomacy and whatever, and yet Formula One has a permanent home in Baku. You know, these are the hypocrisy of, you know, people across the world needs to slowly be exposed. And I just want to get this point in because at some point we have to, and some people are paying attention. We cannot win by attacking the media. And by attacking coverage, we have to send the kinds of emails I mentioned in my opening, which is you see something that bothers you, you see misinformation or disinformation, and sometimes it's just an FYI to the journalist. And say, if you need more information, you can go to this link, or I'm here to talk to you, or I can provide people on background. We have to learn how to do better, you know, media relations as citizen journalists.
Eric, you said something earlier, and I absolutely agree with you. Despite everything, despite the imminent threat on our border and everything, I think now is, I sometimes say I feel very privileged to be living in Armenia right now, to be an Armenian right now, because I do feel that the potential that we have to do change something, that I have to be a part of something is unbelievably larger than it has ever been for the past generations. I don't know, maybe they felt the same way as well, but I do feel that the possibilities of, even though what seems unorganized and even though what seems that like there's no right narratives, not enough storytelling, there's no strategy in place, it also gives this opportunity for just anyone to become that person who does what is, who figures out what's expected, does it, and succeeds in it. And this is where we're talking about also our branding, our soft power. So bringing this sentiment back to our conversation. So far, it seemed that you can never collide soft power with hard power because soft power is always going to lose. Is now a good opportunity to give it our best try?
Well, I don't think we have any choice. That's a given. I mean, I think when you're looking at, first of all, I 100% agree with you. You know, it's very hard time to actually live in Armenia, but it's also, I would never want to be anywhere else under any circumstances. Because we have that, you know, the world is you know, everything can be redone. And that's very scary, while at the same time, you know, it creates these opportunities. We have to have a concerted effort, soft power, smart power, hard power. And
sarcastic power.
Sarcastic power. And we have to, obviously hard power gets triaged to the front, but you have to work on all of these things at the same time. I mean, we have to understand that we wasted almost 3 decades. Let's be honest about it. You know, we say, oh, you know, no. 30 years, you know, Korea went from being poor, South Korea went from being poorer than North Korea to being one of the top 10 industrial countries in the world. Now, we're not exactly the same, but the trajectory is there. Singapore in 1960 was a miserably poor place. We have wasted almost 30 years. That doesn't mean that we cannot fix it in 5 or 10. But the opportunities are there. The work is there to be done. We have the ability to do it. You know, I'll tell you, we have so many horrible, you know, so many negatives now. And I won't name the name, but there was someone from a publication who came here and was interviewing me. And he said they have an Azeri employee. And this was right before the elections in June of 21. And I go, well, what does she have to say? She goes, I wish one day we had elections that we know who doesn't win the day before.
Pre-announce the election results. I was coming back, and maybe like we have only 15 minutes, less than 15, 10 minutes left. Oh, 12 minutes left. So sometimes we're not creating these narratives are being handed to us, because we were saying, yes, we are a democracy for 3 years now, and that was kind of not sticking until Pelosi came and says, oh my God, you are so valuable, you're a democracy, and all of a sudden that our brand, at least politically, shifted because someone else ratified it. Said, yes, I agree. It's not just them saying it, like, we also agree. With caviar diplomacy, this term has been around for like at least 8 years now, and it's not something we created. We just never used it to our benefit because it's a very negative connotation to Azerbaijan's, towards Azerbaijan. And well, the world can know about laundromat and caviar democracy and still ignore it. Again, coming back to my question from a different perspective. Also, the world perceived us as in Russia's shadow, a satellite of Russia, and now with the war in Ukraine and on our borders, the world is starting to see Armenia a little differently, maybe not so pro-Russian after all, which is something we've been trying to say for a couple of years but wasn't being heard. So are our narratives being formed for us in a way right now? And is that a positive thing?
Very good.
Well, maybe not narratives, maybe this, in this case, our image.
I think it's a very good point, Rubina, and I think one thing I've noticed historically in Armenia, let's say social media interaction, is that the validation for something from the outside world has much more weight than when we ourselves cultivate something within our group, right? So the second that the New York Times writes about a particular aspect of Armenia, let's say that, you know, we're the small little country that, you know, surrounded by its hostile neighbors, and we're actually a democracy, or Pelosi comes, all of a sudden on social media, everybody supports the article and pushes it out because we need this sense of validation from the outside, evidently. But I think it's when there's a lack of leadership in a strategic communications framework, which we've had historically for 30 years, then you just basically have an open space that anybody can march in and tell you what you are and define you to the rest of the world. That's a very dangerous position to be in. And that's the position that we've been in because of the corrupt leadership that was dominating this country for a little bit less than 30 years. So now it's incumbent on us to take control of the narrative, period.
I will just add to that Armenians should feel good knowing that corporations need the same thing. You know, non-Armenian nonprofits need the same thing. Third-party validators and surrogates are the name of the game, right? So I think you get a leader from whatever country comes in, validates, and you say, okay, now we feel good about it. So that's absolutely true. Secondly, the vacuum's always been filled by others because we have created the vacuum. We have failed to sort of establish a narrative or tell a story or whatever. That's not the case anymore. I mean, you know, we're at maybe the end of the beginning, and we're maybe entering the middle part and whatever, but at least we're doing it. I mean, 30 years of failure cannot be fixed in 2 years of panic since a devastating loss, which is what most of this is driven by. You know, suddenly there was this wake-up call. Complacency really was the name of the game until 2020. And so, you know, there are good players doing good things now in good directions with good partners, with potential validators and all of that. I think that's what we have to kind of keep working towards.
Eric, any concluding remarks? We're almost at the end of our panel. There's hardly any time left.
I would say, concurring with both Arda and Patrick, yes, if you don't tell your story, other people will impose their stories on you. But at the same time, I think what you mentioned is also a question of being opportunistic, where you need to be, you see an opportunity, you jump at it, and you go from there. I think it's a very valuable discussion. It's a discussion we should be, you know, been having 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but having a coherent narrative that everybody from the billionaire to the taxi driver can in 30 seconds explain to you what the country is and where you're trying to go should be our goal. We are very far from having that ability, but in reality, much more dysfunctional places than us have actually created narratives for themselves, so I'm actually confident we can do it.
Right, thank you very much, and I hope we don't leave any vacuums on you, and we don't necessarily don't create them, because this is our own future, and we're talking about, and especially as a storyteller, to not leave these vacuums or questions that can be taken advantage of. Like, we can be opportunistic, but also let's not create opportunities for others to tell our story instead of us. Or, in that sense, thank you everyone for joining us.
Շնորհակալություն բոլորին։ Խնդրում եմ տեղափոխվել երկրորդ դահլիճ, այդտեղ մի քանի րոպեից կսկսի կառուցել Հայաստան-Սփյուռք տնտեսական համագործակցություն պանելային քննարկումը։ Խնդրում եմ մոտեցեք երկրորդ դահլիճ. Please approach the hall number 2, the big one. Immediately following this session, there will be a There will be a panel discussion on Armenia diaspora economic partnerships. So please approach Hall 2. Hall 2 is the big one. Thank you.